Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Audio for Massively Multiplayer Online Games. My name is Chance Thomas. I work for Electronic Arts. I'd like to welcome you and introduce our panelists. Sitting right here next to me on the left is Michael Henry. Michael works with Cryptic Studios. How many of you have ever played City of Heroes or City of Villains? Right, that's Michael's work. Sitting next to Michael is Russell Brower. Russell is the audio director at Blizzard Entertainment. How many of you have ever heard of a game called, what is it, World of Warcraft? Yeah. So how many of you are Alliance? How many of you are Horde? You were right. It is a little bit divisive, isn't it, Russell? That's good. That's good. All right. We'll try to play on that a little bit later. And then at the far left end is Jeff Scott. Jeff Scott is with Turbine Entertainment, audio director of video production there, responsible for the likes of Asheron's Call 2, Dungeons and Dragons, and of course Lord of the Rings Online. So what we wanted to do to kind of get things rolling is attack this from a very general level first. And before I get started, I'd like to know how many of you in this room right now are actually working on or have worked on audio for a massively multiplayer online title. Oh, this is good. So we've got a few people with some experience. We may ask some of your ideas later too. How many of you want to get into this arena? Want to get involved with doing audio specifically for MMOs? Okay, this is good, especially the guy in the back. Excellent. Wonderful. So what we thought we'd do is then start off by saying, okay, so if I have got to create audio to cover this massive world, 200 hours of gameplay is kind of the average that we shoot for, right? What's the same about that for those of us who are working on console titles, and what's different? And I think we're gonna try to answer those questions over the course of this next hour, getting into some very specific things. But first, let me just throw that question out to Michael Henry, who's worked on console titles. Before that, worked on arcade titles, did a lot of stuff for Atari. I mean, Michael goes way back. Michael,
I'm the old guy.
That's right, the old guy. He's the one with the silver hair, right? So what do you see that's the same in terms of audio for MMOs, and what's different?
Well, first, I just want to clarify one thing about terminology. When you say the difference between audio for MMOs and console titles, we're currently developing a game that is both PC and console, but it's an MMO, and the gameplay experience is supposed to be identical for both.
Oh, yeah, so thanks a lot. Confuse the issue right at the beginning, right?
It's, while I think most massively multiplayer games tend to be PC only, I think that in the future this is going to change, and we're kind of on the cutting edge or the bleeding edge, as you would say, right now with our current project, which I suppose I should clarify is not as advertised Marvel Universe Online, but is Champions Online, a game that we are very excited about.
So then let's say, like, between a single player experience, right? Let's clarify that.
Right.
Well, what's the same?
What is the same? I think that, for starters, the expectations at the end on the player's end, they've all played, MMO players have played console games. They expect the same degree of quality in an MMO that you get on a console title, let's say. So they expect full surround audio. They expect, interactive music scores. They expect all of the things that you find in a console title in a massively multiplayer game.
All right, so there's a kind of this high quality bar that's been established, and not only do you have to address the issue of the massive size of the content, but you've got to hit that quality bar.
Exactly.
All right, good.
Exactly.
Russell, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, I want to clarify the 200 hours. Was that per week?
Anyway. Yeah, right.
The same, I guess, for every. I agree with Michael, and also I would say for every given place the player's avatar character will stand, in that given place, the expectations are about the same. It's quality, it's immersion, it's things like that. It's when you things get very different when you realize you're not on any kind of a rail. It's a big theme park.
Right.
But that gets into what's different, which I guess we'll get to. But,
Yeah.
But at any given moment, I mean, we'd like to have an immersive ambient. We'd like to have some music, depending on what's going on.
Sure.
Or embrace silence, if that's, which is key in MMOs, by the way. And a lot of UI effects and just what you might be doing while you're standing in one place, a battle. In that moment, it may not seem all that much different from a first-person shooter or something.
Okay, so what I'm hearing then, and Jeff...
One thing to add.
Yeah, what would you add to that?
There are guided experiences in MMOs, much like console games, and so we can get you into it, whether it's your newbie experience or whatever. It probably plays a little bit more like a guided linear experience, and not to talk about what's different yet, but that in a MMO, in your open landscape, you'd have more points of interest, using points of interest and these large beds to put the sound in, where when you're going through a linear experience, you can kind of really drill in on the details of that experience and hook audio up to those things. But when we don't know what the player is going to do or what the other players are going to be doing interacting, it can get kind of...
Good. So now we're going to get into, I think, the nitty-gritty, which is why you guys are all here. If what I'm hearing from all three of these audio directors is that we expect as MMO developers to deliver to the player the same degree of high quality, the same degree of immersion, the same degree of interactivity, how do you do that for a title where you're expecting 200 hours or so of gameplay as opposed to what, you might be expecting for 20 hours of gameplay? Jeff, let's talk about the scope and how you deal with the issue of scope for an MMO.
There's a lot of different ways to kind of skin that cat, and for me, they take the open landscape. You can deal with jukeboxes where you just have 20, 30 tunes in a playlist that kind of can, that you can utilize and use different zones. Let's say I'm in a marshland and I have my marshland jukebox, and the question that you ask yourself is, how big does that jukebox need to be? If you have, for in Dungeons & Dragons Online, we developed more of a modular-based music system in the dungeons, where we said, well, we're going to need to support this game with continuing content and do Lord of the Rings. So we need to really get clever on how we're going to design this from the get-go. And so we used what we call the drone generator, which is essentially a jukebox of drones on top of wind tracks and ambient tracks, with where we can quickly produce melodic cues that can actually go over so all the drones go into every single dungeon, but the melodic cues go to dungeon sets. So if I'm in the sewers dungeon, I have the squealing guitar licks, but in the other one I've got the flutes and violins. But even though they're over the same sort of modular based music system.
So if I understand this, so for example, to cover all these dungeons, you've got an underlying drone and then a set of different melodies that you then call. Do you call them randomly?
Yeah, and so the drones are basically let's say there's 100 drones, right? And you just create all these raw sounds, right? And then in the 3D ambient environment, we call off three-dimensional musical cues, sound effects cues to kind of create an atmosphere of a realistic atmosphere or scary atmosphere. And and the melodic cues basically will have a jukebox, so I'll have 10 music cues, and I'll say, every 5 seconds play one of them, never play two of them at the same time, or maybe play two of them at the same time. But you have to have some faith so the way you have to write that music is a whole different set of saying, unless I'm going to write like an orchestral piece of music that's very defined, and which we've done a lot of as well. So this is just one example.
This is for stuff where you need lots of coverage,
yes,
but it's not particularly a dramatic moment, right? You're just covering an area and you want to set a mood, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So you've got these drones that you put in there, and you overlay a handful, you allow the engine, I guess, to choose randomly from these certain melodies. So how many different melodies are we talking in a certain dungeon set?
Well, let's say maybe 20.
20. All all right.
Maybe more, maybe less, maybe a variety, maybe I'll mix a couple. And so what you do is you have all these collections of data, and I say, well, I got to create a new dungeon set. Well, I can take, this portion of this collection and this portion of this collection and mix them up and create a new environment with existing assets. And that's probably my phone. But, no, maybe it's not. So you just have to get clever with how you manage data, which is a whole other topic that we'll probably get into. And there's lots of different ways to do it.
Okay, now Jeff mentioned about orchestral music being kind of a different animal and having a little bit different role. Those of you who've played WoW or followed Russell Brower's work recently know that he has created a substantial amount of orchestral music for the WoW expansion. Russell, why don't you talk to us a little bit about how you approached addressing the music needs of a massively multiplayer online game with an orchestral solution?
Well, actually, when I arrived at Blizzard, which was about 6 months after the initial commercial release of World of Warcraft, the music engine and the approach to the music had been determined and had been out there for a while. And you remember earlier I said embrace silence, and of course I meant relative silence, not complete silence. But one way that the team then and to this day we keep from having to write just an insane amount of music and produce it and keep our quality up is the music we just don't try to play music all the time.
Sure.
And in fact, if it is certainly one of the goals to not have our players shut the music off, as Marty says, do no annoying. Well,
right.
we do have our cues play. They kind of feather in out of the ambience, and then they play for a while, then they feather out, kind of disappear into the ambience. And a well-designed cue, it's not always obvious where the ambience begins and the music leaves off. And then the distance between that time of fade out and the next cue is somewhat randomized. And we played with those timings for quite a while. And then the other half of the equation is just how much music do you make? And the original game, which is really a huge amount of virtual acreage, Island of Manhattan times 2 or something. Wow. I believe that there was somewhere on the order of a couple of hours of music, 2 to 3 hours of music in the original release. And with the success of WoW, and thank heavens Blizzard believes in putting that money back into the game, and they have, and they have blessed the approach of just adding more. I think from when I arrived to just prior to the release of the first paid expansion, we added about 3 more hours of music just in dungeons and filling out some of the old areas.
I was going to say 2 to 3 hours seems really on the low end for a massively multiplayer online.
And then Burning Crusade, we added just over 6 more hours. And then in the patches since then, we've added 4, and I'm adding a 5th hour next week. So
we've got 16, 17 hours of original score in the current iteration of World of Warcraft. Is that accurate? Then?
Right, and it's just starting to feel, and it's mostly in the newer areas, admittedly. We did sweeten the old areas a little. Every character goes to the inn to rest. Each major city and the small towns and the different factions have places where you can rest, and if you log out there, you get greater XP for that being in a rest area and whatnot. And so we created a whole special set of music to expand that vocabulary in the inns and taverns, which was very cool.
So it's interesting. If you've got 17 hours of music in this game, how many of you in this room are composers? That's pretty prolific. You could probably hire all these guys, right? So come see Russell after, right? I'm just kidding. So who's writing all this music? And talk to us about the management of that. And then we'll come to the other guys and let you talk about that as well. Who's writing all this 16, 17 hours of music?
The lion's share was of the, well, let's just take the 6 hours for Burning Crusade. The lion's share was done by 3 of us. I think I did about close to almost 3 hours of it, and then 2 of my staff members did the rest. And we each have complementary skills. If any one of us was gone, there'd be a hole in our collection of talents.
So you have in-house composers.
Yeah, I'm kind of the old school orchestral guy, and another person, Derek Duke, is. I didn't think anyone could beat me in the gearhead race, but
right.
he has.
He has.
Do all this great tweaky stuff, and Matt Ullman, who was with us then of Diablo fame, does this kind of Wagnerian pastiche with layers and layers and layers of reversed lap steel guitar.
Oh, wow.
I mean, texture guy to the max. So between all of us, we had one good composer. But we worked really hard. It was a lot of work.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
We really didn't get much outside help. A little bit.
A little bit. So most of that's been handled in-house. Now, Michael, what's your approach? I know you just shut down Marvel Universe, but let's talk about what the game plan was for Marvel Universe. I mean, what were you looking at in terms of how much music and how you were going to cover that?
The game plan for Marvel Universe Online is essentially pretty much the same game plan for Champions Online.
Okay,
can't go into too much detail about that, but I can say that we do have anticipated 200-plus hours worth of gameplay for this title. And obviously, to echo what Russell just said, that's a tremendous amount of gameplay time. It's just impossible, and you would be crazy to even try to do it, to cover that with wall-to-wall music. Drive players up a wall, they'd go insane. So we have to have an intelligent system that governs when music gets played and for what type of game events music gets played. If it's zone-based music, when you cross into a new area, a tune plays that gives you the flavor of the area, and maybe it fades out after a period of time. The system that we developed for City of Heroes and City of Villains essentially worked that way, where there were neighborhood boundaries that you would cross into, and you'd hear a tune that was associated with that neighborhood. And if you went back and forth across the border, it would know that you'd been there within, the last 20 minutes. It wouldn't continually trigger it. For Champions, we've gone a little bit further than that, in that we're tying music tracks to game events in a number of different ways and trying to make the music more interactive and change with the nature of the gameplay. And we've got a brand new system that we're working with right now that is...
how do you do that?
It's a lot of iteration. You have to really... That's one of the things I think about being an audio person associated with an MMO. You have to spend a lot of time actually playing the game yourself. You can't just rely upon a producer coming to you with a spreadsheet that says, I need tunes for this, and this. Yeah. You have to play, and we are constantly, myself and my coworker Joe Lyford, constantly testing each other's work, playing through zones from beginning to end, playing through missions, and seeing how that gameplay flows. Is the music working for this thing? Is it not working? Is something totally unexpected happening that we were unaware of? Because, the way game development is, with stuff changing and getting added and getting tweaked and designers moving stuff around every day, it's a constantly changing environment. So there's just no way to stay on top of it unless it's you as the audio person that's doing it. It's really difficult to hand any of that off to a QA department, because they don't know what's supposed to be there. They don't know if what they're hearing is a bug or not, or if they're not hearing something, it's because you haven't gone ahead and populated that area with audio yet, and maybe it's just not playing because there's a bug. They have no way to know these things. So really, the audio person is the best tester. But
so it sounds like you are your frontline QA department.
Definitely.
You and Joe. Now, you guys have a 2-man audio staff, right?
Yes.
And Jeff, what's your audio staff?
2.
You got 2 guys. And Russell, what's your audio staff?
For World of Warcraft, I'd say about 3 3.5.
About 3.5 guys. All
Yeah,
right.
I mean, there's 10 on our staff, but we do everything Blizzard does, which has gotten to be a big
Much
scope of
broader.
work, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's interesting. He brings up this idea of QA and play testing. Let's talk about that for a minute. So I happen to know that both Michael and Jeff, in addition to Russell, are also composers. Now, Michael, do you find time with all this QAing that you're having to do, with all this play testing, do you find much time to do any composing yourselves?
For me, yes, I do. Is it as much as I would like? No, it's not.
No, okay. Same answer.
Quite frankly, we've been spending a lot of time talking about music. We also have to deal with all the sound effects that are in a game, and we're doing these superhero titles that have all this, or World of Warcraft. I mean, my God, you got all this magic stuff and all these crazy sounds, environment sounds, all these things have to be created, and those obviously that's a time-consuming thing. If you want to make that sound good, those kind of things are difficult to contract out, in my view. At the days of when you could go to a contractor and say, well, I need 10 sword clangs. Give me 10 sword clangs and give me 10 bloody sword impale effects. Those days are long gone because things really have to be tailored to the animations. They have to be maybe randomized so that you're not hearing the same sound exactly the same way over and over again. And it's highly technical work, and it's time-consuming to put that stuff in. I find that it's much easier to contract out the music work. There's a lot of great composers out there that do contract work, and that's just the area that it makes the most sense for us if we've got a budget to work with, is to just get some help on that end, and then when we have a little bit of slack, then Joe and I can sit down and we can do some tunes, create whatever we can to kind of fill in gaps here and there.
Gotcha.
Pretty much the way it works.
Jeff, what do you think?
Very similar for us too. I think we spend majority of our time on the integration because that's really where you're mixing. So maybe if you think about the amount of music that you had and all the work you had to go through to get the music up and mastered and mixed and sounding great, and your VO mastered and recorded, and then you're in an environment where it's all being mixed in sort of real time. And I feel like that's probably one of the bigger challenges I faced over the past couple of years in creating these games was making sure the volume of the whole game wasn't going down, because you kind of just say, well, that's not loud, that's too loud, so you just turn it down. And you say, oh, that's too loud, and you just turn it down. And, getting to a point where we got to bring everything back up, and just doing a mix of, you have all of your entity-based sounds that are playing off of your animations that are 3D positioned, you have your ambient tracks, your music tracks, and all these things, and it's all in 5.1, and so it's a lot to handle, and you can't QA. I mean, even if I do go and I play with my 10 sword clanks, I might not hear all 10 sword clanks.
Right.
I might play 50 times and not hear all 10. So it's pretty complex, and the amount of effort that goes into it's pretty great. And I think you just need to have really talented teams of people. The individuals that I have on my team, they're incredible, and I think that's what you need: dedicated, really talented people.
And versatile.
Yeah, you got to wear every hat.
You got to wear a lot of hats.
Every
don't
hat.
you? Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the challenge of mixing an MMO. So you have the same elements, I guess, that you have in a single-player experience. You've got your ambiences, you've got your sound effects, you've got your creature sounds, you may have some dialogue, you've got music. You also have voice chat in a lot of games, in a lot of MMOs. How do you, first of all, just by the show of hands, are all three of you using proprietary audio engines that your own company's developed in-house? Or are you using a third-party audio
I would
engine?
say that we're using middleware, but we are building custom applications on top of the middleware.
So all three of you guys are using middleware and then building custom application set. Okay. So talk to us about how you decide what's important for the player to hear with all these different things happening, with so much unpredictability in the experience. How do you decide? And talk to us about the tools that you use to mix the game virtually.
It's gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
I got myself a GM account, so I could go into the public servers and just watch. I'm an invisible naked dwarf flying in the air. Get over it. And I'm there, and and I'm listening to different size raids. I go into the big towns and watch. I mean, I play like as a live player too, but there's some dungeons I can't get into, so I have to use the GM account. So I get in there. No one knows I'm there. I listen and try to get a sense of, it's situational. There's no rule, because a raid has really got one set of priorities. And when the voice chat's going nuts versus what's going on in a busy town versus just exploring, questing out in the wilderness.
So let's talk about this idea of a raid for a minute. Because in a lot of typical single-player games, you go into a battle, and all of a sudden there's the big combat music, there's all the big sound effects, and it gets really noisy. And you just said that during a raid, you got voice chat going crazy. So how do you score with sound? And I'm not talking about just music, I'm talking about the sound effects and everything. How do you address these battles?
In one way, there's no real one way to do it. I think we provided a mixer for the user. If you're using voice chat and you want to turn the music down, I mean, that's what you got to do if that's your thing. Mm-hmm. So it really, I think MMO is really that experience, the customizable experience for you, and you have to give them the controls. And unfortunately, the player has to know that they can go in there and do that. And it's hard to say, this is the one experience, because it just isn't that way.
Yeah, this is one of the very difficult things about an MMO, I think, that is different from a console title. When you have these large open worlds where dozens of people can team up, they could all, if it's a superhero game like City of Heroes or Champions, there can be a team of 10 guys and another team of 10 guys, and they're all in there, and they've all got these over-the-top superhero superpower sounds. They're all going off at the same time. Sometimes, if you play all of this stuff on top of it, it's just cacophony.
Right.
So you have to have a way to thin this out and communicate to what the player needs to hear. You have to have a way of determining the important things for each player. And so all the mixing really has to be done on the client side. And so you have to develop some system, whether it's proximity-based, of course, is the number one thing, is okay. Or if you know that person is being attacked by an enemy, that's an important sound that they absolutely have to hear. You have to have a way to say, well, I look at it and I say, well, anything more than, say, 20 sounds going off simultaneously, you're just not going to hear it. It's just going to become part of the general audio din. So you have to have a way to just find what is important that the player actually needs to hear, and that's a programming challenge that needs to be met in order to be successful.
One of the biggest things that he said is that with the attenuation fall off, that's really where all the mixing goes down. Because your volume can be as loud as you want it to be if it's a 2D sound playing right on top of you. Once you put it in the world, it's quieter, and as soon as you start moving it away. And that's really where things get really complicated when you're trying to mix these games, because it's not a stereo image and that you're hanging out and turn down the guitar or whatever. It's really move this guy away, and where he is in physical 3D space, or a waterfall. Like I can hear a waterfall in reality really far away. But in a game, do you want that? Because I may not even know that the waterfall's there, and I just hear a lot of static, like a white noise sound.
Right.
But there's this other aspect to it too, in that if sounds are attached to objects in the environment, you might have a sound that's it's a computer console that's in a room somewhere, and it's making beeps and boops and whatnot, and you have one in this room. Well, and you tailor your sound for that one computer console in that room. Next thing you know, you're firing up the game a couple of days later, and some designer's got a new level, and he really liked those computer consoles. Now he's got a room with 30 of them in there, and you got 30 copies of your sound playing simultaneously, and it's like, oh my God. One day in development, I had a fire sound. It was a huge explosion and a huge fire that was used in a hangar area. And it was a big event that finished the level. So it was this over-the-top explosion and this gigantic fire, that had a huge radius on it. And of course, fire visual effects are scalable, right? Mm-hmm. And so one day I fired up another level, and I walked into this, it's a residential house, and I walk into the lobby, and I'm hearing flames everywhere I look, and I'm like, I don't see any fire. And I go back and I go upstairs and I go up into this room, and they had this event going on in the room where people were burning books. They were throwing them into a pile, and they had used the same flames that they had used in the hangar zone that had my sound attached to it. They went with the sound and just scaled down the visual effects and layered a bunch of copies on it. So it was,
the sound
so
was this same huge
yeah,
gunfire explosion.
this is another one of those issues. You have to have a way of divorcing the sounds away from the object. You want to be able to attach them to the objects because obviously with these levels being so huge, going in and placing individual sounds on every single thing in there is just like, wow, I could spend the rest of my life doing that with a game that has 200 hours worth of gameplay. So it's good that you can attach them to the objects, but you have to have a way to disable that on a case-by-case basis.
Right. So you've had some nightmare stories along those lines yourself, haven't you, Russell?
Well, it's very similar. So I don't even need to go into it. It's the same
thing.
Exact same kind.
Same thing.
I was going to say earlier about the raids. As WoW has matured, I think we've gone from a raid situation where the players go in and just fight something till it dies, and then they all leave, to a thing where there's more narrative. There's more lore-rific story unfolding, and because of that, that's actually given us more opportunities to emphasize the changes of state as, say, something is being, the boss is being crippled little by little, and then he goes, wait, and then calls in all his minions and turns the tables, and this may happen 3 or 4 times. And those big changes of state, which is starting to appear more and more in the game, is giving us opportunities to hammer in more music, more effects and everything. But then during the battle itself, kind of keep things low-key, because it does get cacophonous, and less is more usually in the big battles.
Okay. So it's interesting because we were talking about these raids, we were talking about a 10-person team having a battle. Do you customize the listening experience for each member of that party? I mean, does each member of that party hear something slightly different? I mean, do they hear what's important to them, or do they all kind of hear the same thing? Jeff?
Well, yeah, it's definitely that brings up your client-server relationship and how you deal with sounds on the client's end versus going over the server. So the scripts that are running for me aren't the same that are running for you. And my sound could be totally different. I could be playing different music. I could be, from my cues. So my experience is actually, and so you have to have a lot of faith in the stuff that you put into the game, and for it to play right. So, you know what I mean?
Okay. So, like, for example, Michael had said, we need to know what sound is important to this guy. If a monster is attacking him as opposed to the guy, at the other end of the sun. So do you do any mixing based on that? I mean, is it a proximity priority? You mentioned that. How are you guys handling that?
Proximity is everything, absolutely.
Proximity is everything, Russell said, absolutely.
It's a big theme park in a box, so the mix is where you stand in relation to fixed objects that make sound. One thing that has come up for One thing that's come up for us, we found a lot of families playing together, a lot of couples playing together in the same room. So we actually have worked to get more of the sounds in sync so that people aren't sitting, this far apart and hearing different music. And that was embarrassing there for a while. So we're working on fixing that. But there's proximity and then there's contextual stuff. And as we found more opportunities, we've worked with the designers to get situations where we can play things to just individual players. And we did an end game encounter about a year ago, where the boss speaks kind of through mental telepathy to each character individually, and he'll maybe only do it to one of the characters, and the voice will come right into your ear if you got headphones on and say, "Your friends will betray you." And so you've got one player going, what? And then we'll wait a while and do it over
just
here
creepy,
to this
man.
guy. Your heart will explode. And just these little things. And it's just been a gas watching the players go nuts.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Did you hear that? No, did you hear that? So the more we split it up, those kind of things is really cool.
That's very interesting. That is very interesting. Okay, so We've talked then about the scope of an MMO. We've talked a little bit about what's the same and what's different. We've talked a little bit about dynamic mixing. We know that all three of these guys are using audio middleware with some customization. Let's talk a little bit about the production pipeline. So in more traditional media, audio is typically post-production. In games, we like to get involved early. Where is audio and where is sound and music in the production pipeline? How carefully do you have to watch the other disciplines as they're developing? Talk to us a little bit about that.
It happens for us in the QA cycle. So when we actually, because nobody ever leaves real time for the audio team. And it kind of makes sense. It's one of those things where you can get bitter about it, but I think it makes sense. The game needs to be polished to a certain level before you start audio production, before you start integration. If you're trying to do integration too early, you will chase your tail, and you'll put something in there and it'll change tomorrow. Waiting for the right time. You're going to do it once. You're going to do it right. You might have to do it twice.
This is a cool thing about MMOs, though. They just keep going and going. So we always have something to do. We may be in final post on the patch that goes out in a couple of weeks, but we're mulling over our next big paid expansion. As a composer, what I love to do is gather up all the concept art, and then as soon as they can let me into a new dungeon area, or new level, or new continent, whatever, I'll take 400 screenshots and I'll put them on my screensaver, and I'll live with them as long as I get. Sometimes it's months before it's really ready for me to write. But by the time I get to write, it's, I don't know, something's gelled in my subconscious.
You've lived there.
Yeah, and
really?
I keep revisiting it, maybe update my screenshots and stuff, and read all the background lore and everything. And the extended time frame or ongoing nature of the MMOs makes that actually a pleasure. So even though maybe a couple of us will be crunching, the other couple of us will be doing our research and homework, and we just kind of keep trading off. And so when it finally comes time that it makes sense to write the music, I just kind of go, and then it's done.
Right.
It kind of happens in a big burst. Okay, it's not quite like that, but it's
prolific wrestler, right? So we want to give you guys as much opportunity as possible to ask your specific questions to these guys. And I want to open it up right now. It's a little early in the program compared to usual, but we've got three of the best and most experienced in the business right here. And I'm sure you guys have some thoughts, some things you'd like to ask them. So let's go ahead and open it up for some questions and see what kind of discussion we have going on.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely use the mic.
We've got a microphone right back here. Please use that so that we get it recorded.
This is sort of the YouTube era as well as the MMO era. And so I'm just wondering about user-generated audio and music and things like that. Have you been experimenting with that or looking at that?
Absolutely. Jeff, I think you can probably address that.
We put it was kind of a pet project. We put a music system in Lord of the Rings Online. If you've played the game, you might have seen people jamming out. We essentially just gave them instruments. We tried to get all crafty and make it really complicated. Then we realized that, well, if we just map the notes to the keys and give them an instrument and just let them play, we got a lot of people really jamming out. We also use ABC notation so people can write their own songs or upload songs or whatever. So I've spent a lot of time working on that. It's probably
Talk to us about the details of that for a minute. I mean, how did you create that? I mean, are you playing MIDI?
No,
did you have samples that you created for all these different instruments?
I took a guitar and sampled the strings. We sampled a lot of our instruments. We got live players. All the stuff is live instruments. It's all WAV files. It's pretty burly and big, and it's a kind of a big download. But we're working on that. And so, yeah, I mean, the details of it were pretty simple. We tried to get Steve DiGregorio and myself were the primary guys on this, and another guy named Doug Applewhite. But we kind of designed it and implemented it in like 2 days. Because it was just really simple. It was give them instruments.
Right.
Give them the keyboard, map the notes to the keys, give them 3 octaves, and give them a bunch of instruments. It took longer to create the animations than it did to do what we were doing.
Wow. So what instruments did you put in there that you allow your players to play?
There's harp, there's lute, there's flute, there's clarinet, and it goes on, and we're just keep adding instruments, and people are really getting a kick out of it. You can go up on YouTube and check out, and if you search for Lotro music system, there's hundreds and hundreds of videos of people playing music.
So people are digging it.
Yeah, I was wondering if you gentlemen could comment on the pros and cons of setting off specific music cues when combat starts.
So the question is, if I understand, what are some of the pros and cons of triggering a specific music cue?
I'm sorry, combat music. When players get into combat, some games set off a music cue when there's combat music,
Exactly.
like a la Final Fantasy. And I was wondering if any of you had strong opinions either way on that practice.
So strong opinions on the use of quote-unquote combat music as we generally appreciate it in the game industry during a fight in an MMO.
I can answer on my current project, yes.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, we actually have created a system for our current title that employs a degree of interactivity with the boss battles too. Depending on the boss's health state, the music changes in intensity and so on and so forth. So it makes the boss battles much more interesting and exciting and rewarding.
Right, right. Russell, you were shaking your head yes as well.
Well, our players are clamoring for it, and internally we're clamoring for it. And the music engine that we've had since WoW hit the streets isn't really capable yet of doing the kind of stuff we dream of. Now we have bent the designer's scripting engine, which controls the spawning in of things, how a boss battle unfolds, and all of that. We've tortured that to where it can simulate some of this stuff. And so our most recent encounters, the Black Temple, where you bring down Illidan, if you are prepared, is the designers were really challenged, and yet when they were done, they were really excited because they had basically simulated our normal music engine, and then once as the battle progresses through these different states, and it was one of those things where he gets weakened to a point, then he brings in some support,
backup.
and then someone betrays him, and it's all this stuff unfolds, and they were able to trigger music in ways that programmatically or engineering-wise might not be the most elegant thing, but what matters is what the player hears, and it gave us some ideas toward the kind of music engine that we want to grow this into in the future.
So it sounds like you're actually scoring the experience.
Absolutely.
In a way.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay.
Hi. This is for Russell. Hi, Russell. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when World of Warcraft shipped and then you did Burning Crusade had just about almost twice as many minutes of music as the original ship, right?
About 3 times.
Wow. So what's the goal for Lich King, more, less, and why? As far as music goes, or are you going to put more focus on the sound design for all the new levels and all that?
Well, it was actually D, all of the above, because there was more sound design in Burning Crusade than by far. There was many more things covered. We call them doodads, the little props that are in the world, many of which make sound, little spinning whirly-gigs on the goblins' structures, or objects that are being held aloft by the fell magic that some of the races employ. And we covered much more of that in Burning Crusade, along with the additional music. As being composers, we talk about music a lot, as someone said, but the sound design was huge. Now, for Wrath of the Lich King, the new continent is slightly bigger than what we added in Burning Crusade, so I know we're not going to go down in the account, but quality is everything. We didn't want to put in 6 hours of music. We again, Blizzard being the success it is, we're thrilled they poured the money in. We were able to secure more live players. I think virtually every track had live players on it. Maybe not all live players, I'd say out of the 6 hours, maybe about 2.5 was full orchestra, 50-something to 90-something pieces.
The rest was the synth stuff for Shatterwrath and all that?
I'm sorry?
The rest of that was the synth stuff for Shatterwrath?
Synth or samples, or again, Matt Ullman is just, he's the master of sound designing his instrumental stuff. He's actually a very great player of both guitar and lap steel and flute, bass flute, and a good keyboard player. And so, well, if you remember his scores for Diablo, I mean, my gosh, really neat stuff. And he applied a lot of those techniques and style that are uniquely his to the kind of the more nether regions of Burning Crusade.
And I just wanted to say whatever money you guys blew on the budget for the VO for the small 5-man, 10-man encounters, very worth it. Thanks. I appreciate it. Because I will never be a big player raider. I will never do the 25-mans. I don't care. Too much guild drama. But for the small scale, it's really cool. So thanks for doing that.
Thank you. Great.
Concerning the voice production, you focus more on music, sound effects. What is the role of voice in MMOs for the future? There's such a big amount of content, and you also have to take into account that voice means that when you go abroad, you also need to localize the voice. So how do you see recorded voice against synthesized voice?
You know, that's huge. I'm glad,
it's a
glad
great
you asked,
question.
because some of our competitors have chosen. I don't know about exactly what you guys do, but I remember when WoW was starting, EverQuest was the pioneer, and I know on EverQuest 2, for instance, everyone speaks. I mean, every quest is spoken out loud, and that's a huge commitment of resources, and so that's definitely that gets into logistical decisions.
It does.
It's also, I mean, in the case of EverQuest, not to diss anyone's work or anything, but it's a problem. A lot of the players don't want to sit there and listen to a bunch of dialogue. They're like, come on, I want to get through this thing. Finding some kind of balance between whether you have to actually say everything, or can you do a mix of some greetings that give the guy that you're talking to some sort of character, and then use a combination of that with text that the player can read or click through really quickly if they know what they're doing. It's one of the issues I continually fight with our designers is I'd love to have more character voice. I want more in the game because I just think it helps so much to bring characters to life when they just sit there and they don't do anything, and some text pops up in a bubble. Well, you know, I don't get a sense of what that guy really is.
Sure. I think we're in a territory where game design is really dictating this. Yes, there are logistical issues and resource issues.
And localization is huge. I mean, it's one thing when you got to translate all this text. It's another thing we were talking about, like City of Heroes was in, I don't know how many countries we ended up being in, but 20 plus countries. We're going to record 20 languages for this thing. I mean, it's just, it can quickly become a nightmare. So trying to find a balance between the amount of voice that will add something to the game and not annoy people, I think is that's a challenge.
It's a huge project to do that, right? I mean, you need a project manager just to deal with recording, or just to get the information together. Even getting all of the dialogue out of the game with character, with description, with accent, having enough information to give to the actors so they can successfully record the VO is a huge challenge even within itself.
All by itself.
Yeah.
Wow. He mentioned maybe synthesized voice. Is that anything that either of you guys are looking at currently?
Not here.
No.
It hasn't come up.
No.
Yeah, once they get a little better at it, I think it would be kind of cool.
Good. Next question.
Hey guys, given the fact that you guys got to do like thousands of sound effects for each of your games, which ones of all the ones that you've done or all the ones you plugged in are your favorites, like spells, or is there like a specific, ambience that you really like, or what?
Your Murloc sound, Tracy. Tracy,
I was so not fishing right there.
Yeah. Tracy worked on the original WoW.
So daunting.
Guys,
Favorite sound effect? That's I don't know. You know?
I got a lot of favorites.
Yeah.
I couldn't begin to tell you. I mean, well, that super blasty chest cannon thing that I just did last week or whatever.
Yeah, you always want to outdo yourself. So the best thing I did was the last thing I did.
That's right. Most recent. Good. Clint?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, you guys have largely answered this, but it'd be interesting to see you address it at Win One Shot, which is to discuss your philosophy and your mindset in approaching this art and this craft, and as it relates to pivotal lessons you've learned over the years from doing this. One example being in combat, so many sound effects at once, having to deal with that. And also as it relates to what you're after in terms of the experiential quality of the player's experience, each individual living out their version, their experience playing this game. So basically your mindset, your philosophy, and how it's been shaped over the years by lessons learned. Thank you.
So key lessons about developing audio for an MMO and handling some of these challenges.
Well, you mentioned something philosophically to talk about that. I think a lot of it's like if you're a composer, you have a certain mindset, and it actually lends well to being a game developer. And if you understand song structure, melodic structure, harmonic structure, I think it really relates really well to just development and the development cycle. Just in you've got beginnings and ends, and you have to be able to. I think you learn. The biggest lesson for me was learning how to start an idea, finish an idea, and ship an idea. And that's what you do with music. As you're growing up writing and playing music, that's what you're doing. You're practicing that. And so getting into game development and shipping these big games, and that's really my biggest lesson is that, now it becomes second nature to you. And I think it's one of those things that you see people struggle with.
Excellent. So you see a real parallel between
Absolutely.
life and development as a composer and life and development as a game developer. Russell?
I think I'm going to talk about what I think is the next great frontier here, because I don't feel like I've even had the chance to properly address it in my career yet, and that is the intelligent, the artistic culling of the noise, of the extra sounds from the landscape. In real life, we do all kinds of selective hearing we're not even aware of that we're doing. And it's different when you're watching a movie, and the movies become really applicable to games at this point, just a lot harder, games are a lot harder to control. And I'm a real fan of Walter Murch. I don't know if you've heard of him. My intermediate goal is to implement some of his concepts into real-time AI mixing, if you will. Yeah. To oversimplify greatly, and you can find this stuff on the web. He goes through a process, and he uses Apocalypse Now as an example, where he takes every sound and he kind of weights it on a spectrum. Is this sound to be taken, does it communicate a literal thing, or does it communicate kind of an emotional or subconscious thing? And he kind of gives it a rating. And as he tags each sound, if you will, in a given moment, and he literally goes moment by moment, as he tags each sound, he then finds he can't stack too many of one type together in one moment. He can have one over here and two over here, or one and one, or two and one, but three on any side will kill you. And the example he gives, he talks about a scene in Apocalypse Now, and Martin Sheen's character's there, and initially he put the dialogue right where it needed to be, and then wrapped everything around it, carefully making sure everything ducked a little around his dialogue, and it made great sense on paper, but it was just mush when it was done. And so then when over trial and error, he developed this weighting process, and he decided, okay, dialogue's important because he's scared, he doesn't want to leave the safety of the chopper. So that's important, that's communicating something. The chopper he's on represents safety, so we got to keep that. The noise outside, the guns and stuff represent danger, so we got to keep that. And so on and so forth through 8 or 10 levels of stuff. And when he got to the music, which had been hugely important in the previous scene, he realized this is adding nothing. But instead of just ducking it down, because it was adding nothing, he took it out just during that line of dialogue. And it's actually a pretty gross edit. The music's coming along like this, and it's like, bam! And when the dialogue's done, it's back. And you can, if you don't give it away like I just did, I can defy anyone to notice that the music went away. Because your brain is tuned into the things. And so it's my notion that maybe with intelligent tagging of sounds ahead of time, which is going to be a lot of work for the sound designers, some of those decisions could be maybe at least aided by a computer. I mean, it's right there. I think that's the next frontier for me, because we can play far too many sounds at once.
So you're talking about bringing dramatic focus to your audio mixes.
Contextual dramatic
focus to your audio
and,
mixes.
We can't be there riding the faders as much as we'd like to, or we can with film, but maybe we can influence some computer writing of faders. I'm really oversimplifying, but I don't know. Watch this space.
Right.
Maybe we'll do something on it when we find out what we've got in a couple of years.
I'd just chime in very briefly here because I know there's more questions, but yes, Walter Murch, definitely, if you're a sound designer, check him out. His theories are legend. But I think that in addition to that, I think that a common mistake among sound design people when they get into a situation with an MMO or this huge world and it's got all these sound emitters in it, and they take a real world approach. They say, well, if that thing were in Manhattan, it'd be making a noise. So I'll put a sound on it, and blah, blah, blah. I'll put a sound over here. Sometimes smoke and mirrors is a better approach. You don't need to necessarily populate every single thing. It's what's important, what is going to create the overall effect. Because like Murch says, I mean, the human ear is only capable of paying attention to maybe 5 sounds simultaneously at maximum. Anything more than that is just adding to cacophony. So tailoring your sound environment to communicate what is important to the player is a big deal.
There's a site called transom.org, and about 2.5 years ago they did a series of interviews with him, and he basically has an essay called Clear Density, Dense Clarity, and it's all there. And
his book on
him and Randy Tom, man, just check those guys out.
What's it called? I can't remember the title of his book.
Next question.
This is a question about iteration, organization, and design. And obviously, when I'm working on a game, I put my sounds in, and I'm like, oh, I got to fix that. I got to fix that. The scale of an MMO is obviously huge. And how do you make those checklists? How do you disseminate information to the team? How do you are there specific models of version control, or especially with rolling releases and things like that? How do you keep track of all that information and then play the game and make those checklists of what you got to fix?
Good. So what is your process for iterating and keeping track of the iterations?
We did talk a bit about this being one of the biggest issues. That goes right back to the QA cycle, where you have to do your own QAing. You have to go in and constantly be playing the game and constantly making those checklists. I use a whiteboard. I have a whiteboard. You go, you play the game, you're like, that sucks. Got to fix this, got to fix this. Go out, and you'll get in your tools, fix all the stuff, go back in, check, that still sucks,
So you use a whiteboard as opposed to like Perforce or something like that?
Well, we use Perforce, we use SourceSafe to do all the check-ins.
Keep track of your version.
But I'm saying just having a whiteboard is probably one of the most crucial things for me to just to keep the rolling.
Right.
I would add too that it being online games, we have the advantage of we have a large pool of testers out there, and if there's something that's wrong with audio, they will let us know. And all you got to do is browse the forums for your game, and boy, you'll find these threads of, boy, I hate that sound. Oh, I can't stand that sound. Well, can you get rid of that sound? Can you change this, change that? So we get a lot of free testing.
Yeah, that's a great place to find that information.
Russell, final thoughts?
Well, we do have to test everything ourselves, and I think probably our biggest issue is just keeping track of everything that's been created. I mean, the team generates very formal lists, and by the team I mean the designers, the artists, the people who are defining the scope of the world of Warcraft. They generate lists, and that's great, but there's 100 people working on that thing. There's 3 or 4 of us, so stuff slips through the cracks, or someone gets an idea, or they do what you described, the reduce, reuse, and recycle thing, or enlarge and recycle, and copy and paste the sound, and pretty soon it's like, where are those big footsteps coming from? And we looked everywhere but down and saw it was a little tiny thing that was once 50 feet tall running around. And not everyone writes everything down because it's moving so fast. The demand for the content is huge.
And even if they did, you'd just be reading all day.
Yeah.
You can do
We rely on our crack staff of producers. I would be in an asylum right now if it wasn't for these guys. So, to my team, I thank them.
Well, that's wonderful. We'd like to thank you for joining us for our Audio for MMOs panel. To Jeff Scott and Russell Brower and Michael Henry, thank you very much.
And to Chance Thomas, our moderator.